Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talking about the role of animated interview in online world, including the possibility and limit. The practice of animated interview in online world is a method I have utilized in order to extract footage and narrative in the view to the final outcome, an animated documentary. This animated interview is one way to know and understand our world. For animator and animated film, it will be one of very subjective research methods to interpret certain knowledge on a social cultural context in every context, eventually the represent in the thing out there into the imaginary animated world. Before just discussing this main issue, I should mention about the reason why I'm focused on the animated interview for my current ongoing research and what knowledge I wish to gather through this method. This is because for me, as an animator researcher, it is very important to understand how the Korean constructs identity in a social cultural context using the virtual media such as online games and animated film. In this case, plenty of South Koreans are overspending their everyday life on the living in and interacting with the online world as divided consciously and unconsciously. I focus on divided Korea that would be connected with the concept of Robert Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, that would be connected with the concept, the concept is Robert Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll, Hyde, as one of great Scottish literature. This is because my research is to adapt this Jekyll and Hyde concept into a contemporary context. It was derived from here, Edinburgh, 125 years ago. After over 110 years, it might be represented into the concept of avatar or virtual subjectivity in terms of construction of identity in online games such as Second Life and MLPG. MLPG means massively multiplayer role-playing games. Actually, since 1996, at the first time over the world, many of South Korean people have lived somewhere in online game as one of animated world, where offers interaction to be able to control of avatar as a 2D or 3D computer-generated imaginary puppet to play the game and then express themselves as hiding their real mask. Like Jekyll, they utilize their supernatural power with the help of technology, and they start to rely on Hyde. However, this is not only serious dark side. It allowed them to evolve this new way to construct a self-identity and socially communicate and interact with others in cyber guild and communities. Therefore, for the animator and animated interview between avatar in online animated world has a strong impact on itself as a method for collecting data and the production for understanding the specific case of a cultural issue, especially ethnical identity in a documentary context. It might be speaking to the concept of why Korean must be double and divided between animated and reality. I will introduce my presentation contents briefly and quickly, and the main issue as a thorough answer from the question will be covered in the following page. Some question, what is an animated interview in animated world? If online game, especially MLPG, are related to extend from the traditional puppet animated film on the internet offering SNS, social networking service, what is the crucial role in the internet-based the virtual animated world, such as Second Life and Mabinogi? Mabinogi, one of the game name, and MLPG. Is it the new alternative interaction between real, outside of online game, and the virtual animated inside online games, or real people and virtual avatar to review the meaning of animated reality in terms of new documentary actuality? If the natural game playing the works as a equivalent to live action footage and it is captured and recorded, it can be viewed as a documentary, as an alternative performative mode in itself, which might represent cultural and ethical identity. It will examine how an animated interview conducted through the online game, such as Second Life and then MLPs, can play a role in documenting certain people and their voice, as well as chat as a type of conversation about their story and narrative under ethnography, addressing the specific case of the divide or double Korean or Koreanese. The virtual ethnography and online interview. There are 5 steps. The big point is juxtaposing with the viewpoint of online interview, the playing the avatar. The first step, non-participant observer in the online world. The second is non-observing participant in the online world. Third, participant observation in the online world, joining guild and getting the credibility to form the rapport with other participants. The fourth step, informal or formal interview, based on semi-structured interview with other players. 5th step is finding analysis from the collecting data on a capturing interview and animated footage. So there are main issues from the part 1.5 to address my question. As you can see on the screen, in this animated film, the animated interview is offered a certain aspect, even if it is private or public subject, in relation to kind of knowledge as recording and capturing the live action in a documentary context. As finally is creatively interpreted into animated representation about actuality. At this point, it allows audience and user to encounter not only unknown view and meaning, but also it affords special experience and knowledge through the interactivity or interaction between animation and reality. This interaction will be offered from the conversation when to the interview as a specific way in which they relate to personal and individual subjectivity. It might be accessed in terms of actual reality in the ethnography. Therefore, if these interviews are recorded and captured as the footage in documentary context, it can be recognized as not only a normal indexable element and a factor in live action, but also represented something inside an invisible actual world by being performed, animated into an animated documentary. But what about online animated world, even if it happened to user every day? When we approach the puppet performance on the play stage and animated film, we can easily find each different. The apparently different thing is often the control hand, but all of needs for the puppet play and action for animated film are created by master and animated individual hand. Compare this, playing the avatar in online is operated in the fabricated world based on automata system in the computer, which allow audience or user to offer power of creation and the control of their puppet on 2D and 3D imagery. Like the invisible hand in animated film, all of these online games have an inventor, invisible hand, as it starts and plays out. With the invisible storyteller hand, it automatically turns off the next page and falls into a fabricated world where it's feeling digests and mimesis in the online. At this point, the new interaction would be happen not only between user and animator, but also amongst user, avatar, and animator. In this case, for animated researcher, they can interact with online avatar user in the virtual world as the given new environment by the online game inventor in order to find and construct some knowledge through the interview as being auto-animated in itself. This new interaction makes it possible to form a new style of interview. This can offer the documentary with animation as recording and capturing the natural online game playing the avatar. That means it will be possible to record their voice and narrative through the interview and the conversation, despite being a copied footage from the original real-time video animation produced by inventor. I hope it is called and termed as documentary avatar. There are two examples. The Animate interview. I'm sorry it doesn't contain English subtitle. So, as well as concern. This is happened to the somewhere between actual and virtual. What is the most interesting thing? From their interview, including conversation, is that even if they are able to clearly distinguish their identity and live on the virtual from the actual, it seems that they are confused of their boundary depending on what situation is better and beneficial for them, so that they can flexibly choose one of them as avoiding hard talk in an interview. For example, one of a couple in Second Life Korea cannot be made of their relationship on the common sense, on the actual society in Korea. It is possible for them to get the close partnership along with their agreement on the virtual world in Second Life. Yet they were confused of their ending and the relationship until when and where it is going on. Even if it was strongly denied during the interview, it is like the play on the stage on the online. That means they utilize the avatar at the whole for the escape when push and comes the shove between animation and reality. However, it is not only considered as simple escapism, but it also seems to be related to reaction from the lack of communication or association in real world. This is because Korean avatar users strongly wish to encounter and communicate with other people, regardless of sex and age, from the pressure. The next part is the documentary, outside or inside online world. That means the divide Korea inside or outside. It has raised the integration of how the concept of documentary avatar is different from documentary games one. It was termed by Boggers and Poremba. They state documentary game is related to the outside of world, where it is not only concerning the representation of real subject from the historical event, but also the function to approach the actual situation with a different view on the mix of animation and the game contents. It is called as a serious game for educational purpose. Interestingly, I found this kind of online serious game is the JACE and the G4C, Game for Change, the Korea, the collaboration project, the Green 2011, the Nanoplanet, which is focusing the divide Korea. So we're watching it together. Inside online world compared with outside outside of online world. Unlike this serious game, Second Life and MLPs to offer the user-centered contents of how they can create their own narrative themselves in the virtual world as the distinguished area of impossible world, given the game contents by game inventor. As mentioned earlier in the part 2, throughout online animated interview in both Second Life and MLP's game, it is recognized that there is the documentary element inside online world as some of a common point. In this case, the animated online interview allows just the posing with the interview viewpoint and realizing the fact that these animated interviews are communicating their actual experience as a reaction of the limitation of the lack of identity in the real world. The most Korean users pursue the lookism and level up to cover the deficiency and the lag in the actual world. The visual images are absolutely westernized, even though they are able to express that their avatar look like their own biological natural beauty. But I can witness some of the Korean culture in terms of the Confucianism as the vertical relationship along with the age. That means some of Korean culture are reflected onto virtual world. I want to say this desire to level up the stronger. This is very apparently seen in the MLPG games such as Mabinogi, which compared to interview in Second Life, it has been hardly interview with other user. This is because usually they are very busy to play the game with the focus on the level up and avatar item, such as weapon, helmet, armor. Some of item cost was tilted as over 3,000, 4,000 pounds. It is obviously found by the interview on which many of Korean users in MLP games are very concentrated on the issue of how to quickly achieve their upper level and getting stronger against others. And it is one of the important points for MLP game user to get the respect and attention when they join a guild and making relationship with other user. However, depending on user age and inclination, their play value will be different. So some footage. Five minutes, all right. It's kind of some Miss Second Life Korea competition. Who is most beauty? They really care about their appearance always.
네, 그럼 이제 발표만 남은 게 없습니다. 네, 지금부터 제가 발표를 하겠습니다.
Why they always care about their appearance? In physical world and virtual the same. One more, please. It's like Korean party, the barbecue. But it's based on the Confucianism. They really care about other people, age, they respect other people. So I can find some Korean culture in Second Life as well. Yes. And then there is another Mabinogi game. One person making different kinds of avatar. And they just visit and deal in the item, what kind of clothes, what kind of some item you have. And I can make myself my own visual image, and then I can sell in other people with huge money. And this is cyber credit into some real world cash as well. But this is illegal in South Korea. Okay, finally she happy? No. Okay, I just 5 minutes. Okay. From the online animated interview and the footage I have done so far, I suppose it might reflect the dual or divided Korea between actual and virtual. That means the virtual online world is quite close to the actual world, will offer alternative but temporary or endless identity and environment against being in animated themselves in society. Otherwise, the Second Life and the MLPG footage could be understood as a new documentary actuality, especially as in the Korean case. To support the idea these people reenacting their actual experience as a reaction of lack of identity in the physical world. There are the two example footage to support my idea. The one footage is a real interview. During the 2 months I visited South Korea to conduct my field research, this footage showed the different people, including doctor and psychology and game addicted. What is Korean identity? Why is it divided? So I'm sorry it doesn't contain any English subtitle. It is still just in pre-editing. Yes, plenty of people, they just introduce, yeah. The psychology, why they just always care about level of appearance. He told me in South Korea, the elementary school student people, they have their own culture, 캡평. Character 평가 means in South Korea word, the character assessment. Who is much better of appearance? Okay, one question more, one just enough to teach more. Please. All right, okay, thanks. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. This is an example of a Korean documentary that's showing the 21-year-old male that cannot distinguish fantasy from the real life. He has fallen in love with the character on the pillow. And he finally get married. Just marry. Okay, I'm quickly finished. I'm sorry about that. Okay, they feel they have no voice, the social pressure. They feel they have no way to express the social anxiety that they have encountered, and therefore they use the online game as a vehicle for their emotional life, for their political life, and for the general ideological pressure to conform to certain identity that they don't want. So there are some findings through the online interview as the Korean is. The huge number of the guild and community relation, guild war, and the gathering culture in online, offline, hierarchy, Confucianism age. I'm quickly just reading, it's almost time's over. So constructed various avatar, the social relationship with other between the real world and virtual world, and they level up. And the mix of culture zone, the visual image on avatar in Japanese animation and game story, the concept from North European myths. Some of professors told me, Korean have that do any that kind of concept. We just borrow that kind of item from other country to overcome our complex in real world. So it is typical some visual. Why some Korean avatars visually is quite similar in Japanese animation sometimes. And then concept is yes, North European myths and temple nights culture, something like that. So absent lack of communication in real world and various leisure culture, the place. No any that kind of channel. It might connect to the structure of Korean society in terms of rapid compressive growth in a short time. The Ogoban said the cultural lag and Emil Durkheim anomy situation, even if it has long history, traditional culture, 4,000 South Korea history has. It is not only for playing the game, but it's also to truly communicate with others, the strong relationship between user and participant as a virtual kin. I found some possible and limitation as well. I'll just read some keyword. The virtual cyber ethnography is offer the situation, the social interaction, communication online, and the lack of detail, casualty. To understand why they just feel that kind of pressure, I found a very important thing, because South Korean people experience IMF. They lost their they lost their job, and they have no any place to visit to play their life. So some just people who lost their job making PC game room, and a lot of people just lost job. They also visit that kind of PC game room to kill their time. So to understand this individual action, the social cultural context, it might be it's very needs to the kind of some interrelation research between online and offline world through the field works. And then it's a really big issue is ethical issue, the virtual ethnography, because their information is quite private. Thank you so much for this presentation, and then thank you for Paul Wells and express your consent.
No, I said perhaps one question and then other questions from the other. Anybody have anything they'd like to raise? No, okay, that's fine. You're very polite.
It's about animation. Professor Paul Wells.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, okay, so what we ought to do first, I think, even though we've got the rest of the evening to have and films to watch and stuff to happen, we need to thank two people for what has been a very important conference. And I want you to put your hands together, please. Big thanks for Johnny and for Naya. Thank you. Why is it an important conference? Well, I'll tell you why it's an important conference. For those of us who've been involved in animation studies, animation-oriented events for many years, it's been a hard slog. You know, we've got animation to the centre of things in many ways. It's being talked about all the time. It's being addressed. There's lots of focused study that there never was as little as 10 years ago. This kind of conference represents another move forward. It's another point of focusing. It recognises animation documentary as something that's significant, exponentially rising, more people making animated documentary, but certainly its study is something that people are taking up and pushing back frontiers of theory and analysis around it. So it's an excellent spot that it was a necessary thing to do. And it's been great to do it. We've had a great couple of days, and I will endeavour, in the midst of kind of the next bit of babble, to kind of maybe pick on a few themes that I've picked up across the couple of days that I've tried to kind of place into this talk. So, with no more further ado, everyone's saying, hey, look, what the hell is this title about for a start? Well, it's a serendipitous moment, I've got to say. It's a moment that came about first by my son's discovery of the Sex Pistols, which was great, and secondly by the fact that I read an article in American Scientist by a guy called Kurt Bollacker. And I was so amused by the fact that his name sounded like a genital that I really just felt that it had to be the title of this paper, So that was the moment that gave me the title. But it was also, of course, linked into the idea that I'm thinking always about the ways in which we can think about animated documentary, animation in general, afresh. And, for my purposes today, I wanted to kind of set up a loose enough structure so that I could maybe talk a bit about what happened in the previous 2 days, but also kind of take my own line on things as well. So that's the kind of thinking, and we'll try and sort of get into it. Now we're in a really important moment, as I've said. It's great. We've got Jonathan here, and Jonathan, mainstream animated documentary, very excellent piece of work, and one that signals that animation, can be used at all times for serious purposes. It really gets me down regularly when things like Waltz with Bashir kind of emerge, and critics who are not aware of animation say, blimey, animation, it can deal with serious topics, And so like, for those of us who are invested, and for animation people who've known that animation can cope with serious topics and has done for 100 years all over the world, it's no revelation. But nevertheless, animation coming into the mainstream and making its point is very important. So, we have mainstream television. We've talked about the Green Wave and its significance. Interestingly, recently, I'm sure that you saw that an anti-terrorist video was made, in animation, and then they had a kind of anxiety about it and didn't want to go ahead with it. But it was interesting that choices were made about serious topics, high-end social topics that were going to be made with animated film. And currently at the Barbican in London, been very involved with this, is the Watch Me Move exhibition, massive exhibition, 1,500 feet of 1,500 square feet of space. Dedicated 3-month exhibition that's going to tour worldwide that brings together art and animation in that culture in that way. 10 years ago, they wouldn't have funded that, they wouldn't have had make that happen. So if you're in London, go and see it. I think it's a decent show. But the bottom line to it is that we're in a culture at the moment that it's embracing animation and developing it, but developing it through this mode of animated documentary. Where does that leave us then? Well, it leaves me, anyway, in this particular instance with this kind of game plan. I thought, how the hell am I going to talk about this, given that we've had 2 days' worth of top-end natter about it? You know, lots of people out there are very versed in the writing, very versed in the practice. What the hell am I going to add to that? How can I find a structure to talk about it? Well, this is what I'm going to do. Basically, I'm going to offer some perspectives drawn from my own early documentary practice and its influence on my engagement with animated documentaries. So a bit of all our yesterdays there, and we'll try and belt through that. Drawing upon then a range of multidisciplinary viewpoints that have helped me in further understanding what animated documentary might distinctively offer for a theorist and practitioner. And that's drawn again from my interest always in going to other disciplines to see if I can find ideas that are pertinent to my understanding of animation and the way in which I might talk about it. So I'm going to go down that line. I'm going to conclude then with some points about my own current practice again and its relationship to these formative influences and the notion of the need to embrace a broader field of non-fiction animated films. I might as well come up front and say that in the sense that I'm anxious at this point in the game that we're shoehorning far too much into the term animated documentary. And it would be nice, in many ways, to unpack a broader set of definitions within animated non-fiction so that we talk about essayist films, ethnographic films, and a whole range of other cultural definitions that widen the range of our understanding of animation as it's used in documentary and other forms without us feeling it's got to be shoehorned into that one term. So that's why I'm using the non-fiction to kind of raise that issue, really. And my initial assumption today is that animated documentary is the inevitable outcome of rethinking issues about repository, site, and archive. So they're my starting places. Let's see where we go. Okay. Basically, when I was a kid, I was very lucky, I think. I had a very formative experience in terms of my English teacher. When I was at school. It was at school. It's extraordinary to think this when I think back. In relation to Truman Capote's book In Cold Blood. Some of you will know that it's actually a non-fiction novel. It's based on a real-life murder that took place in Holcomb in the United States. And Truman Capote was coming out of a tradition of new journalism, basically, with people like Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe, where there was a kind of narrativization of real-world events and trying to actually depict them from the inside, trying to find the kind of psychology and emotion of those events, as well as the kind of facts and the depiction of the facts. And I was very lucky. I had an English teacher called Frank Startup. Great name, great bloke. He was brilliant. And he did a class simulation of In Cold Blood. And he cast me as Alvin Dewey, the copper. I was the copper, naturally, you know. And basically, I had to interview all these people and sort of like I had to discern the murderers and all the rest of it. And it was so influential to me, hugely influential, to the point where, you know, I tracked down kind of versions of it. And there was a Richard Brooks film of it in 1967, which was done in verite style, very verite style, going, in fact, to the Holcomb house to actually film some of the things. That must have been a bit creepy, you know, go and film in the place where murders take place. Good idea, verite, you know. And the police sold them the latrines that the murderers used, you know, when they were going to go for hanging as well, you know. So that's great, you know, documentary footage of the place where they pissed. Brilliant, you know. So verite stuff, very much verite stuff. And I decided what I was going to do was to, in fact, do a piece of theatre about it. And I did a piece of theatre which was called, you know, which I termed at that time non-fiction docudrama. Look at me, you know. And it was, anyway, I basically staged the murders, staged the hanging and all the rest of it. And it got a lot of attention. And I was very lucky that I ended up doing a version of it for television, directing it for television. And I never really kind of forgot its kind of influence. And I ended up writing about it later on. And I talked about it as multiple evidential sources in an aestheticized reportage. So you could tell by then I'd got into universities, you know, and sort of like you write that sort of shite, you know. But it's interesting in the sense that it still stands up in some ways. A range of sources drawn from kind of, you know, the real world, played out in an aestheticized way, but operating as a sort of mode of reportage. And what that led me to was the idea that also art could be viewed as a model of historicism. So all of these kind of things were kind of active in my work at that time, and I discovered Calvino at that moment, and here's something he says: the sociological inquiry film and the historical research film make sense only if they're not filmed explanations of the truth that sociology and historiography are saying. For the true essay film, I envisage an attitude not of pedagogy, but of interrogation, with none of that inferiority complex towards the written word that has bedeviled relations between literature and cinema. And that was a very kind of provocative thing for me, because I felt at last there was a sense that we could trust the visual, that visual evidence and visual sources were things that, you know, that were acceptable in the ways in which we could actually engage with historiography, engage with a kind of sociological principle, engage with an essay, that we could actually have a visual essay of sorts that was not predicated on, you know, traditional models of kind of literary, execution. So this was all very encouraging me in terms of the stuff that I did, and I took this into making radio series at that time, and in terms of making, for example, a range of documentaries about British film, and it was very interesting. I got a lot of interviews at the time about the idea of, Paul, why would you do film on the radio? That's intrinsically visual. How, you know, gosh, fancy doing that, you know. And basically, of course, the point I want to make here is and all the points I'm going to make, I'm going to stretch out to this notion of animated documentary, is the fundamental importance of sound, you know. It's something that we don't really talk about as much as we should, but so much of the legitimacies of animated documentary have come out of ideas about the soundtrack and what the kind of the interview gives us, what, as it were, the soundtrack of real-world space and atmosphere and particular kind of recordings of real events enable us to say, in terms of a kind of, indexical relationship to, you know, to the real world. And that's the only time I'm going to use that word, because it's come up 345 times in the last 2 days, and that's all good, but we can probably move on now, you know. And it's that sense that you know, having embraced that idea about sound, what was important for me was, for example, that I thought at the time that the responses to film were sometimes inhibited by responding to the literalness of the image and the mental quest when we watch films to determine narrative. We're trying to find out the story, we're engaged with the literalness of the image. And I thought if I could do on the radio a model by which, you know, the use of kind of film soundtrack and analysis could work in a particular way as an essay, what I might be able to do was use the suggestiveness of sound to either recall famous scenes so that people would remember them, or to reimagine them. And I was always in a position at that point that however I wanted to use visual sources for documentary purposes, I wanted the idea that we were rethinking things, reimagining things. And as you can tell, you know, I want to bring that to the party as just something I think that we're always doing. If we're embracing documentary and embracing a use of animation within it, we're rethinking and reimagining. And I think that's what's progressive about this form and why people kind of find it an attractive one to work in and to think about and to talk about. Now, what happened after that was, you know, I made a whole range of documentaries about all sorts of topics for sort of, you know, television and radio and so forth. And for each time, I was trying to address this relationship between, shall we say, factual models of expression, particular kinds of generic models of art, and the ways in which we could kind of rethink, reimagine them. And that sort of tunneled its way through to particular practices that, you know, that I ended up writing about. And at one point in the game, when I was writing about animation initially, I was also writing about documentary for the Introduction to Film Studies. And then at some point, Paul, are you still doing that, the documentary chapter? Yeah? And Paul took over the documentary because he was far more, you know, averse about it than I was, and I stayed with the animation. But at one time, I was writing both of those chapters in that. And that was at a point where, in fact, people were starting to think about animated documentary. And I did an event at the NFT with Bob Godfrey, and basically was talking about animated documentary at the moment when Brian Winston, in Claiming the Real, was saying, gosh, we've got to be careful, digital technologies are coming along, the authenticity of documentary is over, you know. Poor Brian, he's just panicking, you know. And of course, he was especially panicking because by that time, you know, people were already saying, well, there's animated documentary. There's, you know, there's this kind of work going on, to which Brian flatly refused that. He flatly would not accept that there was animated documentary. It was not about the kind of, you know, verite forms and so forth that he acknowledged as the documentary form at that time. Bob Godfrey, of course, we showed great, and he viewed that immediately as a documentary, and the whole day was taken up with the idea of kind of reassuring ourselves that that was the case. When was that? 1996, you know? And here we are, sort of 2011, and we're still trying to persuade ourselves it's okay. It's okay. It is. We believe, you know. And the whole thing is that not merely do we believe, but all over the kind of media, this level of belief, you know, is active. You know, how different is Bob Godfrey's Great to the idea of what's going on in Horrible Histories? You know, anybody who watches that show and sees kind of like the animation that's done by Tim Searle in that, or the way in which they play out historical models, is not far from the way in which, you know, these kinds of models are being used in animation for any number of years. So all of these kind of factors, you know, developed and grew. Many people started to finally invest in this, and some people will know this. You know, I wrote this essay, again, 1997, this was, in Art and Animation, talking about 4 modes of animated documentary, largely taking up Bill Nichols' work at that time, and positing these 4 areas. Basically, I mean, I've been really hugely surprised that people still refer to them, but, you know, they kind of stand up in some ways. You know, this imitative model, borrowing from, revising, repositioning established codes and conventions of newsreel, travelogue, fly-on-the-wall, verite. So, in other words, borrowing from more established documentary modes. The subjective, using individual voices or perspectives in order to evidence alternative social and cultural histories, particularly crucial in the reclamation of different kinds of personal histories and cultural histories that were previously repressed in certain cultures. The fantastical, revising or repositioning known social and historical subjects or events in a newly fabricated context to suggest a different ideological interpretation or a model of critique, basically repositioning kind of historical agendas. And the postmodern, social and cultural narratives with no proven authenticity, actuality, or authority from orthodox evidential sources, but which may nevertheless offer up a relevant truth. And, you know, some of that stands up, they all overlap. People have taken some of that on board and argued with it over years, and that's the reason why it was written in the first place, to try and drive dialogue about this. Of course, what happened was that animated documentary grew. We finally got at the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam some programs of films and a panel about it, and it was really interesting. It was really kind of contentious, ironically. You know, people like Nick Broomfield were there and Werner Herzog were there, you know, supporting the idea. But the big kind of verite guys were going, you know, this isn't a documentary. Why are we talking about it? Why do we need this? You know, and it was still, you know, a very contentious kind of idea. And yet, of course, you know, documentary festivals, you know, have grown all over the world. The DocFest at Sheffield this year has got animated documentaries, though not as many as before. But what's crucial is that there's been a development of a literature, and that's been important. Bella, who's here, you know, very important, you know, development in the field in terms of Bella's work. Now, I think it must be the most referenced PhD that I've ever encountered in my working life, you know. We need to actually get that out as a published book, since it is the front end of the kind of dialogue about this, and you know, and she's done great work all over. But equally, Annegret, who's here as well, has done fantastic work, because Otto, and she talked about this morning, Otto Alder was, you know, for a long time in East German context, championed documentary, animation, and animated documentary, and that, you know, that's just been a given in terms of a dialogue there. But what Annegret's done is bring that into the academic community, joined up the dots between the festivals community, the documentary community, and academic discourse, you know. And that's really important work, and I know a number of people in the room have contributed to that, and that's been terrific. And of course, in November, I think, there's a dedicated edition of Suzanne's journal dedicated to animated documentary. So we're getting a literature moving in that way. And, you know, and people are responding to that. And this is what this conference is about. You know, it's bringing that literature together, people engaging with it and making it work. So all of those factors are absolutely fundamental. So what about my own kind of, you know, connection at the moment? Well, I've just written a piece, again, for Suzanne's journal, that's engaged with kind of early cinema and the work of Arthur Melbourne Cooper and Shurieff. Now, for me, going back to a term that I've used on a number of occasions over the years, these are very early films demonstrating documentary tendency. Arthur Melbourne Cooper, for example, was a newsreel cameraman, and when he came to make animated, films, playful animated films using match figures, basically, his first ones in 1899 were animated matches playing volleyball, animated matches playing cricket, and ultimately, matches of peel. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the whole choreographies of the real world are still being played out in symbolic agendas in animation as early as 1899. There is a documentary tendency as early as that in animation history. And Shiriev's films, made between about 1903 and 1906, something like that, of course, are documentary records. He was trying to preserve in animation the national folk dances of Russia that would otherwise be forgotten. These ballet, classical ballet dances that came from all sorts of Russian national contexts. How are we going to preserve them? What can we do? Basically, he made these fantastic 2D and 3D films recording those dances. Here, 1903, 1904, the documentary tendency. So all of those factors I tried to write about in that journal, but of course one of the most interesting kind of developments also, and this is going on across Scandinavia particularly, is a real interest in industrial film. And at the heart of industrial film, again, are lots of documentary tendencies, the kinds of things that a lot of people have been talking about in terms of the use of graphics and graphic information to communicate information, education, and so forth. Very good book by the guys at University of Amsterdam, Films That Work, and basically all about industrial film. And there's a project going on across Sweden that's actually Sweden, Norway, Denmark, that's dealing with that, and offshore work in Norway as well. So these tendencies, are across the field and they're beginning to join up. But they're not necessarily about animated documentary, they are about animated non-fiction. For my own work, basically in terms of a couple of recent books, in the script writing book I did, we talked there about aspects of how you might write and develop sort of this kind of work, not to an extensive degree, but in reimagining animation, again, started to talk about the reflexive nature of animated documentary and some films that occurred there. And in terms of PhDs recently, there's a range of people here. Mario Milichello, I've been supervising, who is situating his graphic drawing work in the mass media context of the Thatcher era. And those kind of tensions are also at heart when thinking about these documentary forms. Equally, a student of mine, Hunsyuk Lee, making an animated documentary about the nature of kind of a Buddhist philosophy, but trying to actually reflect the feeling of that, the transcendent feeling of that, not located in any character animation at all, but through the environment of a monastery. And I don't know whether he's successful in that, but he's using the documentary form to try and actually embrace the idea of feeling as knowing. And that's one of the kind of big things that's informing a lot of people's approach to animated documentary, I think, as practitioners. Our whole experiential, emotional lives, are our fundamental truth. How do we reflect those things? How do we record them? How do we deal with them? And animated documentary has clearly embraced that, and I think that's one of the reasons why people are so attracted to it and, again, work with it. Sam who's here, Sam Moore, I'm sure people know Sam's work. But Eye Full of Sound, I think is a benchmark film, very important film, because the whole idea about kind of inner psychological states, emotional states, being played out through the animated discourse is one that actually pushes the boundaries of particular kinds of filmmaking. And it's a pleasure working on a PhD with her. Similarly, Manki, who's just been on, he's just done his talk. He's discovering animated documentary in online worlds, in virtual environments, and he's going in there. He's actually talking to people about why they use, these environments, and he's treating that as a documentary actuality. So this is all kind of the excavations of documentary work. Why do I make these points? One of the kinds of things that one discovers, I think, is that we are, at the moment within the field, I think, preoccupied with the formalism of it, and there's no surprise in that. But at the end of the day, who is doing this documentary work and why are they doing it? What do we want from this form? Why are these people working in this way and what are they discovering? And those kind of things, I think, the content preoccupations are going to come more and more into our thinking. At Loughborough, we did some interstitials that were genre parodies, and we did one about documentary, which was quite an interesting thing. And currently, I'm working on a script for the Oil Museum in Stavanger, which I'll come back to you and talk about later on. So some stuff then, you know, in terms of some provocateurs that might come up in the next few minutes. Going to take on board the thoughts of Eric Goldberg. Some of you know Eric Goldberg, leading Disney animator, animated the genie in Aladdin, for example. Managed to get him over to Animex this year, and he came up with an interesting thought that I want to bring to you. I want to talk about Death Row. This is a range of photographs on my mother's living room wall, which I'm, you know, very, very interested in. Then, of course, my deep-rooted pathological disdain for ceramics. I'm going to talk about that, and my love for football. I'm going to talk about representing the 7/11 bombers. I'm going to think about the work of Robert Smithson, Richard Moss, and Satoshi Kon. I'm going to talk about archiving the future, and then doing documentary work. You know, this is the writing a screenplay for the Orchid. Points I want to raise then. Here we go. First, Eric. Eric came across, as I say, to Animex, and here's an interesting moment, and speaks to those people who've been thinking about the idea of mark-making, drawing, and that as a kind of a model of a possible starting place for how we might think about the documentary mode. Animators are born documentary makers, says Eric. They have to look at everything so hard. Everything must be so closely observed. Each drawing is a document recording how you know something is alive. And I thought, whoa, 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 you know, that's a fantastic observation, but it takes us right back to a kind of a very, very kind of almost starting point about where we believe a kind of evidential you know, model works. So I bring that thought to you as I'm going to bring thoughts here so that we kind of spread this out and reflect, in a certain sense, what people have been talking about over this last couple of days. I'm going to go down to my mum's Death Row wall, which is great. My mum has got loads of pictures up on a wall, of dead people. Basically, they're just all dead, and the only person who's alive is this one, and that's me. And you know. And sort of like, you know, always fiddling with myself, but there you are. And basically, you know, I'm the only live one there, you know. And my mum, who is, you know, we don't get on, I've got to tell you. And you know, and basically, she basically said, "This lot are why you are like you are." Right, I say, you know. And then she sort of hobbles off, you know. And it's so pejorative, you know, she looks at this lot and obviously has utter disdain for them and utter disdain for me, frankly. So the whole kind of thing is really interesting. Why? I'm asking. I don't know any of this crowd, you know. I just don't know any of this crowd. Now, the interesting thing there is that what am I starting to think about? Well, I'm starting to think about the idea of what actually does that represent, and what does it represent, again, for when we're thinking about animated documentary. So much of animated documentary is concerned with absences, it's concerned with losses, it's concerned with silences. And ultimately, of course, it's concerned with the idea of how do we engage with traditional sources of evidence. And ultimately, what we fundamentally discover, I think, is not only traditional sources of evidence being in some way lacking, but that this ultimately provokes questionable evidence, and at the end of the day, a recognition of lack of evidence. And I think a lot of documentary filmmakers are interested in just that set of tensions. What actually defines evidence? What defines the way in which we want to speak about the world? And certainly in terms of my own kind of, you know, engagement with my family, you know, there is a tremendous lack of evidence, which means I can make it up, which is great. So the bottom line to that is that, of course, I'm trying to link that at all times to, you know, to the nature of documentary. And I discovered this little film. Grandpa Looks Like William Powell. So that we have some entertainment in this hour rather than my complete babble. Let's have a look at this film. Is pulling the clues out of the air and building narrative around clues. And to a certain extent, you know, most animated documentary is kind of engaging with that. And one of the things that I think that does is to drive, you know, certain kinds of narrative. And our duty, in a certain way, is to say, well, look, you know, how do we interrogate the nature of our narratives? What do they actually tell us? You know, how do they emerge as documentary? And this comes back to, you know, this idea about why I loathed pottery, basically. Because when I was at school, I had a school trauma. You know, when you have to choose your lessons for the third and fourth and fifth year, happens in Britain, or it certainly did anyway. And basically, I chose drama. You know, I chose drama. I was going to do drama. Hey, you know, and they gave me pottery. And I was so pissed off. I can't tell you just how pissed off I was to get pottery. And I just went loopy. I just went mental and said that I wasn't prepared to do it. And, you know, and Mrs. McPherson, the pottery teacher, said, "Go and sit down now, young laddie. You know, I'm not having you here. You know, oh, fuck off, you know." And so, you know, and I was not going to do pottery. It was as simple as that. And I ended up doing drama. But it left me scarred, because the worst part was that my mother also collected pottery and vases and knickknacks, you know, and I had this kind of real sort of anti-ceramics thing. And I thought, right, okay, let's just try and resolve that. And I saw a review of kind of Edmund de Waal's book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, and his whole kind of engagement with the fact that he had a set of Japanese netsuke, which he wanted to kind of trace the narrative of. And he's a brilliant, you know, makes great ceramics, does, you know, Edmund de Waal. And I thought, right, this is your moment, this is your moment. You need to re-engage with ceramics, Paul. Come to terms with it. So I read, you know, I read his book, and basically one of the kind of big things at the heart of it was the idea about who cares about something and why do they care, you know, and the whole role of biography, autobiography, and life stories. And you know, a lot of the kind of time that's going on in animated documentary, again, is this notion that we should, in some way, not refer to biography or autobiography or life stories as something that we describe this work as. And I suppose what I'm encouraging is that we should do that. Why? You know, because, you know, de Waal says, you know, a number of things. I'm just going to pick out a couple of bits here. It could write itself, this, I think, this kind of story. A few stitched together wistful anecdotes. More about the Orient Express, of course. A bit of wandering around Prague or somewhere equally photogenic. Some clippings from Google on ballrooms in the Belle Epoque. It would come out as nostalgic and thin, he says, thin. Another thing he makes an observation of when he's looking at one of his relatives, sort of artifacts. I remember that Elizabeth didn't really have much feel for the world of objects, netsuke and porcelain, just as she disliked the fuss and bother about which clothes you put on in the morning. In her last flat, she had a great wall of books and only a narrow white shelf on which she balanced the small Chinese terracotta of a dog and 3-lidded jars. She was supportive of my making pots and wrote me a handsome cheque once I was trying to build my first kiln. But I was mildly amused by the idea of me making things for a living. But what she loved was poetry, the world of things hard defined and alive, made lyrical. She would have hated my fetishizing of her books. And his final kind of observation I want to kind of bring to you here is, I realise that I've been living with this netsuke business for too long. I can either anecdotalize it for the rest of my life, my odd inheritance from my beloved elderly relative, or go and find out what it means. One evening I found myself at a dinner telling some academics what I know of the story and felt slightly sickened by how poised it sounds. I hear myself entertaining them, and the story echoes back in their reactions. It's just getting smoother, it's getting thinner. I must sort it out now or it will disappear. And I honestly think the nature of what we're doing actually is stressing that. Animated documentary, for me, is a way of things not being thin. It's not trusting orthodox narratives. It's saying, let's open up discourses. Let's open up different ways of suggesting meaning, suggesting effect, suggesting ways in which we can, you know, engage with the currencies of the world in a different way than traditional models of documentary, but also traditional models of kind of this kind of expression in other media forms. And that's why I think it's enormously beneficial. For me also, though, what I think we need to do is to kind of unpack these things further. And reading kind of, for example, David Peace's book, The Damn United, which is about Leeds United's management under Brian Clough. I was interested in the sources there, basically, because it's a non-fiction novel again, but it's a point of view novel. It's essentially imagining the psychology of the manager, Brian Clough. But what's its sources? Well, 8 autobiographies, 4 biographies, 9 club histories, 10 English realist novels, 4 soccer encyclopedias, and a partridge. No, and so, you know, newspapers and match day programs, primary interviews. So the whole kind of sense of our life stories as animated documentary, I think, is something that we need to acknowledge. We need to acknowledge that these kind of, you know, can be biographical, autobiographical, historiographical. And those are the kind of things I think will reach out to other kind of models of expression and other areas of expression, so that we don't become insular about the nature of what we've achieved, I think, in dealing with animated documentary. But I think animated documentary is responding to things like these. And basically, this was coming up in the kind of green wave discussion. Very interesting with Gaddafi when he said that the imagery coming out of Libya at the start of the kind of the stuff kicking off there was that, look, the images that they're sending to the West are all photoshopped. There's no reality in those images. And I thought it was a very interesting way of resisting the notion that, that we could ever record anything realistically anymore, that there could be that way of providing evidence. And it was interesting because at that time, of course, they released the kind of the photographs of the 7/11 bombers, but the ways in which those photographs had already been transposed, not from the kind of central image there, the colour image from which they're drawn, but in these other, as it were, badly photoshopped, cropped black and white images that were circulated, to the police. And Jonathan Jones was, picked up on this, and he said the cropped pictures were rendered in grainy black and white from a colour original. That makes them look bleak, brutal snapshots from an apocalyptic nowhere. They are dehumanised and at the same time translated into a type of harsh monochrome. A picture familiar from surveillance shots of bank robberies or car crash photographs, screen printed by Andy Warhol. It's as if they've been fitted into a grim iconography of outsiders, judged already as enemies of society. And he adds, how do we recognise people? It's not just from clinical signs, the shape of a nose, although they even ruined that, but from existential bearing, ways of relating to others. In this picture, we actually see Khan and Tanweer as human beings, as if in a portrait. And actually somebody, I can't remember, somebody was making it was Leon, made the observation that, that our evidence had come from so many other visual sources, pre-film, as it were. Once we arrived at documentary film, it was as if somehow that this was the mode of record. But before then, all sorts of other visual sources, of course, were understood as the way in which we recorded the world and engaged with it and articulated it. And I think it's interesting that he refers to the portrait here because it takes us again to the ways in which we see imagery. And there's a bit of me that says that a lot of photographic practice in conventional senses has become evacuated of its meaning. It's become evacuated of the way in which it carries literal affect. And so, in a certain sense, it's either been conventionalised in the way that we're seeing here with Khan and Tanweer in the black and white photoshopped crops, but not recognised in some of the kind of photography that's available of them in other forms. I think, again, animated documentary in revising and re-engaging with the image is trying to actually say that we can refresh it, reimagine it and rethink it. And in doing that, it offers us possibilities again of reimagining the world and seeing that there are alternative points of view. This is reflected again in people like Richard Moss's work. Here he is, here are these photographs, I'm sure some of you saw these, of pictures of the civil war in the Congo. And basically, we hear tremendous, horrible statistics from that. 5.4 million deaths, in a less than a 10-year period. 400,000 rapes, all of these kind of very arbitrary, unbelievable, sort of statistics. But basically, what does he do? Well, he says, well, I'm going to take some, photographs of this to kind of refresh the agenda here. And he uses Kodak infrared film, it's ex-military stock, and you can see what that does to apparently the literal image. We recognise that as a documentary photograph of sorts, but there's clearly something different going on. Obviously, the nature of the way in which the colour, is functioning. Now, at one stage, we could argue, is this revising photographic cliché? And at the same time, we could say, is it revising political understanding? I'm not entirely sure that photographs of that sort do. I am sure that animated documentaries do, because the nature of the way in which they're taking narrative into that reconfiguration of the literal, that reconfiguration of assumed imagery about things, enables us to say progressive things. One of the interesting things that I want to refer to, though, in terms of Robert Smithson's work, for example, and taking from Nicholas Kay, is the idea about this notion of evidence. And I thought one way of getting at that was the idea of non-site-specific art. There's lots of art that's going on outside the gallery. How is it evidenced? How is it evidenced? And I thought this was quite useful, actually, in the sense that documents do not simply reflect upon the apparent contradiction of attempting to record site-specific works in another place, time, and through another medium, but act out some of the complexities of the relationship between work and site. One of the first observations one might make of these documentations is their sensitivity to their own limits, their willingness to concede the impossibility of reproducing the object. Earth art, land art, and subsequently body art similarly come to treat the gallery space as a place to document or map interventions into inaccessible sites. The site it follows is not available as an object, for it's not static. The site is mobile, always in a process of appearance and disappearance, available only as a dialectical move which the non-site prompts and to which it always returns. Avoiding only to describe the site as a given topology or geography, Smithson records a particular kind of encounter, a certain perceptual exposure. Now you can see where I'm going to go with this, in the sense that you could argue that the animated documentary is almost the quintessential non-site. It is something that's moved away from orthodox notions of documentary, but in itself has reinvented documentary. And in doing that, gives absolutely quintessential perceptual exposure. It's saying, here is an agenda, here is an idea, here is a representation, here's an interrogation. Please understand it differently from the model of something that's articulated on conventional terms. And I think that is really, you know, the great achievement of animated documentary. And it's the kind of thing that then slides into work, for example, by Satoshi Kon, one of the great losses. Anybody who's seen Millennium Actress, for example, it's a great commentary in itself on the idea of the concept of the trompe-l'oeil, the idea that something is so perfectly represented, but nevertheless it is not part of its real agenda. But it provokes particular ideas about, therefore, different notions of shifting register, shifting subjectivity, shifting identity. And Kon takes this up basically through the idea of a documentary maker making a documentary about an actress who goes through various different notions of her roles in various films, but which the documentarist participates in. And in the midst of that, what we start to actually look at is the idea of foregrounding issues of authorship and citizenship accordingly. And again, the ontological equivalence of image status. That's something that, you know, a lot of people have talked about. But equally, one of the kind of things about that is, again, this notion of authorship. At the moment, we're not talking very much about who is doing things or the nature of documentary work in animation. And it seems to me that that's a really important area that we need to kind of engage with. Robert Cole's book, Doing Documentary Work, you know, picks up on James Agee, George Orwell, Dorothea Lange, and Paul Taylor's work. You know, a kind of traditional photographic model almost of documentary record. And, you know, he cites in this Walker Evans, who says, art is really useless and a document has use. Art is never a document, but can adopt that style. And it's a kind of reinforcement of some of the kind of things that, you know, that many people say about, you know, sort of animated documentary. But for my purposes, I want to kind of look here about what is it to do animation documentary work. And all the practitioners in the room, and indeed the theorists, and the people who cross over, I think this is a really important preoccupation. Documentarists have no problem, in a certain sense, of articulating what they think their authorial purpose is. Have we got that sense within animation documentary? I'm not entirely sure. But Coles, for example, I mean, he raises questions like, you know, how ought we regard ourselves? With what degree of scrutiny of our motives and our manner, of why we go where we do, and how we behave while there? Afterwards, what, if anything, ought we to keep in mind? Should we keep in touch with those who we've enlisted as informants, as participants in our project? Put differently, what kind of moral and psychological accountability should we demand of ourselves, who lay claim to social idealism or to a documentary tradition that will somehow, we hope, work towards a social good, expose injustice, shed light on human suffering, or contribute to a growing body of knowledge stored in libraries, museums, and film studios? Okay, so those kind of things are very important. You, as filmmakers and theorists, are creating histories and revising historiographies. It's so interesting to hear so many practitioners, when they've been talking, basically talking about the fact that their films were never understood as animated documentaries 10, 15 years ago, but now they are. Now, what kind of history and historiography is that actually recording? How will we view this moment in 50 years' time in terms of the production that we bring together? Do these films represent a new historiography? My view is that they do. And if they do, how should we best articulate that? And that's one of our challenges, I think, from here. So I'm arguing doing animation documentary work might sort of engage with something like this. Animated documentary deploys the distinctive vocabulary available in animation to interrogate representations of reality and offers alternative visual interpretation as evidence. We're all, you know, pretty accrued around that. Animated documentary insists upon re-engaging with the image, and re-provoking meaning and effect, beyond the assumption of common observation and understanding. You know, I think we can probably tick that one. Animated documentary, therefore, illustrates models of existential being. That's the kind of thing that I'm taking from the kind of things that we said about that I said about the photography already, or earlier, which foregrounds notions of what it is to relate and communicate, as well as relating and communicating its narrative and message. It's self-consciously doing that. It's saying this is the way that we might feel about relating and communicating, as well as relating and communicating. Animated documentary consequently offers potentially revisionist catalysts by suggesting personal codes of thinking and feeling as possible conventions of knowing. And I have this big bugbear, I have this big kind of thing that says, you know, there are so many different ways of disseminating and sharing knowledge. And we get caught up in very specific, conventionalized ways of doing that, when ultimately, here is an opportunity to engage with thinking and feeling again as possible conventions of knowing. And I think that's been very important in what the animated documentary offers, and what a lot of people implicitly and explicitly have been talking about. Such an interpretive strategy in animated documentary often works as a non-site to the site of its subject and object, but consequently offers perceptual exposure. I think it's a really important thing here. You know, it exposes us to a kind of, a model of engagement. It gives us perceptual engagement with that and enables us to interpret it. And there's the possibility there of a creative mobility in an investigative process. This rejects the notion of thin, common narratives, taken from the Dual, in search of thickness discourses. Now, I think it's very important. You know, the interpretation of these films is rich and varied. We've seen when people did textual analysis of many of the films that we've been talking about, that these are dense and complex films, and yet most of them are under 15 minutes, you know. That's very interesting in that sense, because they become sites, they become important points of focus. Such an approach, I think, addresses absences, taken for grantedness, established assumptions, the malleable nature of sources of evidence, because it signs up to them. It says that's what we're addressing. And it also responds to filtering, disappearance, and offers an enhanced address of time, memory, and socio-cultural narratives. And, you know, we've talked a lot about, you know, sort of the nature of memory at the heart of animation per se, but in animated documentary, it's a fundamental thing to be addressing, since most of the time we are looking at psychological and emotional spaces as the articulate conditions, shall we say, of historiography. The animated documentary is thus a key focus of knowledge discourses and a repository of references to past practice ideas and present future codes and conventions of understanding. You know, how are we going to understand the world when we see these films 10, 15, 20 years' time? Well, we have some evidence from the fact that we're recovering animated documentary from 10 or 15, 20 years past already, perhaps even longer. So we're going to see conventions of understanding changing, and that the animated documentary could embrace that. But basically, though, how does animated documentary then relate to the concept of archive? And I want to just sort of like shoot through now to the conclusion on that. And then picking up on, as I say, Kurt D. Bollackers. Great name. How could you possibly go up to them, hello, Mr. Bollacker, and not laugh? I've got to tell you, you know. But anyway, he writes this essay, Avoiding the Digital Dark Age. His primary concerns is you're all making stuff on digital data and storing it in that way, but there's no certainty that we can save that data in the future. So we've got the terms and conditions and freedoms of using digital tools, but we know not yet how we're going to save it. You know, it's no accident that Pixar restrike all of their stuff on film, because they know it can be preserved. You know, we do not know yet all of our digital interventions and practices. Will they be preserved? Will we have historiographies off the back of these films if we don't know how to save them? So the whole kind of issues there are very important article. And then a book that's just emerged, Umberto Eco and Jean-Claude Carrier, a semiologist talking to a screenwriter, which crudely I could bang together as maybe something that I do, that is talking about the nature of this as archive. And at that sense, basically, here's the point: through digital technology, though digital technologies enable creative freedoms to redefine and advance notions of animated documentary, are such texts meant for future address, undermined by the idea that we are as yet uncertain about how digital data may be stored in the long term. So basically, we make multiple copies, we have format transfers, we have strategies for future storage and consumption. That's our best shot right now. But here's Umberto Eco. He's saying, look, scholars are currently researching how culture is in a process of tacitly abandoning certain relics of the past, thus filtering, whilst placing others in a kind of refrigerator for the future. Archives and libraries are cold rooms in which we store what has come before so that the cultural space is not cluttered, without having to relinquish those memories entirely. We can always go back to them someday in the future, should the mood take us, he says. Well, I would say that basically the physical commodities and artifacts that are being replaced by digital counterparts place, animated documentary right at the centre of this debate. Because I think that animated documentary may be key in recording this very process by its address and use of tools, techniques and technologies which speak to past, present and future in different ways. So the very ways in which we make animated documentaries are going to be fundamental to the ways in which we think about archives and the way in which we think about articulating our future practically, materially and philosophically. So, what are we archiving then when we archive animated documentary? Well, I think it's this. A form which moves beyond notions of information or factual evidence into a synthesis of actuality, memory, and aesthetics. Here's Jean-Claude Carrier talking about this. The image in which we often see something other than which is actually shown can lie in a much more subtle way than written or spoken language. If we want to keep our visual memory in any way intact, we must teach coming generations how to look at images. That's a real priority. Now, for me, the whole kind of idea about visual literacy is a huge kind of topic anyway in relation to the future. But in relation to this point of focus, there's much of me that says that visual literacy, is being kind of embedded in the ways of our approaches to animated documentary. So I'm suggesting here that animated documentary is in itself an archive of the simultaneity in invoking attention to visual literacy, while provoking a critical engagement with a socio-historical moment in context. So you're basically saying there's a visual literacy available through these things that a future generation can be taught about, a way of understanding the world now through this particular process. And again, many papers were kind of, engaging with that and engaging with the view that this is a kind of language of expression that we need to take seriously and encounter in the future. So okay, I'm going to go to my final stuff now because we're running on and people want a beer and they want to get out and I've had enough of this and that's fine. I'm not going to talk about this too much. I'm in the midst of doing this project of writing a script about the oil industry in Norway. And again, there's a whole range of issues that can be resolved by actually working this way. I'm not going to cover that because we've got no time. So I'm going to go to my big picture conclusions, okay? Which are these? Documentary making was once an elitist practice, but time and technology have now made it a mass participation activity in some ways. Animated documentary still offers a model of distinctive interrogation and representation, though. Animated documentary offers a moment of arrest between the nature and expectation of literal record in documentary actuality tradition and the immediacies of new digital applications and forms. Now, right now, we might think, there's a generation that are completely comfortable with the idea of digital, tools and digital applications. It's their natural thing. But there's also a generation that still understands the analog. Let's all project that 50 years hence, How can, we broker that moment? Well, I think animated documentary is brokering that moment in a very self-conscious way and will be a way in which we understand the development of image making and moving image practice in the future accordingly. What it's doing, it's brokering an important relationship, I think, between recovery and discovery in the future, and it will be understood in that way. And allied to that, basically, contemporary social media has defined subjectivity and personal narrative as key cultural sites, prompting established media forms to gatekeep, agenda set, and cause market ideological hierarchies. But animated documentary apes social media whilst questioning and creating alternative discourses to dominant media cultures. And I think that's really an important thing to keep hold of. A lot of people are beginning to interrogate that, whether it's in games, whether it's online, whether in different forms of expression. And it's paralleled to this particular moment, and again, I think will challenge these particular models of expression. And then finally then, it may be the case that though the term animated documentary is too limited for the understanding and range of its use, impact and effect, and we shouldn't be frightened of addressing the pluralities of animated non-fiction, and they should be further refined and advanced as they have been. Mega babble there, but I hope it sums up some of the kind of things that went on in the last couple of days. Thank you very much for all of those things from my point of view. It's been fantastic to listen to people. It's really great to have met so many new people as well as folks that I've known for a long time. Hope there was something in that you found of interest. Thanks a lot.